Shahnameh on the creation of the world with Omid Arabian, part 3. Salam به همگی. Salam Omid Jan.
سلام لیلا جان.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this third part of our on the creation of the world from the Shahnameh, from the preface of the Shahnameh, actually. So we've covered about 10 lines so far, and we're going to just dive into part 3 and continue with how the world was created. If you can give us a little synopsis of what we covered in the first 2 parts.
Absolutely. With a quick recap, Ferdowsi tells us, if we remember, that it's important for us to know where the first elements came from, the first 4 elements. And he says this came from an entity called Yazdan, which is a word that means that which is worthy of worship, the creator. And the creator created things from nothing. So it came out of nothingness into thingness. And these 4 elements became the foundation of everything else. And so there was fire, water, earth, and air. And in order, they sort of came, starting with fire and eventually kind of air. And from that, kind of the earth came. And from there, kind of there was this coldness, which became kind of moisture. And all of these 4 started to combine together in different combinations, in various combinations, to create the entirety of kind of this the sky and the heavens and so on. And we talked about how there was 7 that came to rule over 12. And we talked about the 12 houses of the zodiac, which kind of were understood to be how they divided the sky into these 12 sections, the constellations. And then there are 7 planets and stars that are seen as kind of these little spheres, that one surrounding the other, all of which surrounding the Earth at the center. And different planets are ruling over each one of these spheres, like the moon and the sun and Venus and Mercury and so on. So he's kind of taking us step by step through this process of the creation of everything, but from the point of view of somebody who lived at that time and understood what we call the geocentric model, where the Earth was at the center of everything and the rest of the world kind of surrounded our planet. And so from there, we can continue and see what else shows up.
And I don't know if we talked about this last time, but speaking of the zodiac, that comes up so often in the Shahnameh.
Yes.
Really, the planets and the stars do rule over the people.
Yes.
A lot of times they will confer to the priest or the astrologers to tell them what will happen in the future, who's going to be a good ruler, who's not going to be a good ruler, who the love interest should be, who they should not be. So it's interesting that it's coming up right in the preface, telling us how important those are.
Yes, there's these characters called Mubads, who are kind of, as you say, kind of a combination of a high priest and kind of astrologer. And they look into kind of the stars and they see how things are aligned. And in doing so, they kind of give a sense of how the future would go. And it's still also very important to know that characters in Shahnameh do have free will. So it's not just that they're only bound to these kind of notions of fate and destiny. There's also kind of action that can be taken and change that can be made in the course of how things are going. So both of those elements are very much present. But yes, astrology is a very, very big part of how things kind of proceed in the stories of Shahnameh, indeed.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to start on that 11th line, and then let's see how far we go.
So we go back and we start with line 11 where we left off, where Ferdowsi says, در بخشش و دادن آمد پدید ببخشید دانا چنان چون سزید. He says, the doors of givingness and generosity kind of appeared and presumably opened up. In other words, things started to flow from where? From Dana. Dana is that which is wise, this entity that is the wise one in this universe, which goes back to kind of that creator, that source of everything. And that Dana is is gifting, is kind of generously giving. Bakshidan or bakshayesh is the sense of just giving freely. And so this is what happens. Bebakshidana, the wise one gave or granted. Chonan chon sezid. Sezid means as was just, as was proper, as was appropriate. So that which is wise kind of gives through these doors of generosity that which is proper. In other words, everything kind of starts going into its proper place. And that in Shahnameh is one of the most beautiful definitions of justice. Everything in its rightful place, right? Which is very different than what we human beings sometimes think about justice, right? Decisions that court give out that half of us agree with and half of us don't. But for Ferdowsi and for the mystics, the idea of justice is something much bigger than that, and it's everything in the universe in its proper place. And that comes from this source, from kind of this creator of everything. And if we align with that, then we can also be sources of justice in a way, which is, I think, really, really a beautiful idea to think about. Yeah. Cool. So then what happens? This is verse 12. فلک ها یک اندر دگر بسته شد بجنبید چون کار پیوسته شد. Falak is like the sky or the spheres of the layers of the sky, right? So he says the spheres, one after the other, were bound together, were kind of interwoven. So it's not just each layer of the sky or the world is independent. Everything is really kind of interconnected and interwoven in this creation process, which is a beautiful idea to think about, right? The original interconnectedness of everything that appears. بجنبید چون کار پیوسته شد. When this work kind of became پیوسته, when these connections were now put in place through this work, right, things began to move. بجنبید. So they knew that obviously that these planets and stars move, generally speaking. And so once they became created and interconnected, their mutual movements started to happen. Yeah. Then in verse 13 he says چو دریا و چون کوه و چون دشت و راغ زمین شد به کردار روشن چراغ. So as Darya, the seas or the oceans appeared, as Kuh, mountains appeared, as Dasht, which means the plains appeared, and Rag, Rag is a kind of archaic word that means meadows or a meadow. So all of these things started to appear, the seas, the mountains, the plains, and the meadows. And so the earth, by virtue of all these things, Zamin shod be kerdar roshan chirag, chirag, like a lamp, and Roshan meaning shining or radiant. So the earth became shining and radiant like a lamp by virtue of all of these natural elements appearing, right? It wasn't just this boring place anymore. It was filled with variety of natural landscapes.
What good vocab words for us there too.
Absolutely. Then he says, ببالید کوه آبها بردمید سر رستنی سوی بالا کشید. Bebalid, balidan is kind of like to rise up proudly in a way, right? So bebalid kuh, the mountains rose up proudly. Abha bardamid, bardamidan is to kind of like swell up, right? And so the waters kind of start to swell. In other words, the waves go up and down. And as this happens, سر رستنی سوی بالا کشید. Rostan or ruidan, as we call it kind of more formally, is the idea of growing, right? So rostani is that which grows. But in this case, more specifically, Ferdowsi is referring to the plants, the greenery, right? So sare rostani, the heads of these greeneries that grow, suya bala keshid, rose towards the upward direction, in an upward direction. In other words, it's a very poetic way of saying plants began to grow, right? Greenery began to grow. So again, we see that natural elements are starting to appear more and more and more. And then he says, زمین را بلندی نبود جایگاه یکی مرکزی تیره بود و سیاه. He says, the earth did not have a lofty position. It was at the center of all of this. Yeah. It wasn't up above all these other things, planets and stars. It was at the center. Again, we mentioned last time, I think, what's called the geocentric model, which is how they understood the universe to be organized. And so the Earth was a markaz, it was a center, right? Tira بود و سیاه. It was kind of still relatively dark, yeah, black. So what does that mean? He tells us in the next line. He says, ستاره بروبر شگفتی نمود به خاک اندرون روشنایی فزود. Now the stars appear above the earth and they shegefti. Shegefti means kind of wonders, and nemudan is to show. So the setare is the stars. They showed their wondrousness barubar, above that being the earth. So above the earth, the stars began to display their wonders. به خاک اندرون روشنایی فزود. And so onto the earth, onto the soil, they brought and increased brightness. They added roshanai, light and brightness. So really, it's just this amazing. If you can visualize it, it's almost like this beautiful kind of film of one by one, all of these things that we take for granted were not there before, and they're starting to appear and doing their thing, adding something beautiful and meaningful to creation, to existence.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of it as this animation of these things happening in this darkness and this lightness and all these elements appearing and ebbing and flowing. It is a really nice imagery.
Isn't it? And it's incredibly visual, and as you say, it has this flow to it. And that's part of, I think, Ferdowsi's kind of mastery, that he can take us and really kind of show us visually this process that is really the origin of existence, at least in his kind of point of view, in his version of things. Yeah.
I love it.
Great.
I think let's stop there today, but I do want to go back to the first line because that's kind of the more abstract line. You know, all these other ones are actually wonderful. In the PDF guide, we'll have all these words because there's a lot of vocabulary that you can add to your list by listening to this. You know, simple words like darya and ku, dashto, all these. Ragh, not so much, but these are all really good good vocabulary words. But this first line is kind of more, I think, abstract. So if we can go back to that. So dar bakhshish o dadan آمد پدید.
در بخشش و دادن آمد.
در بخشش.
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
Okay, I misread that.
Yeah, that's a great line to go back to. So, dar, so the door, right, or the gate, or kind of the door. Literally, we say dar first, right? Dar bakhshish. Bakhshish is again givingness and generosity.
Which that's a really interesting, you know, it's one of those things in a lot of times I find in Persian, you don't think of the really meaning of the word, and then you kind of think how the words go together. But even in English, it's the exact, it is the same exact formation. Forgiveness, like giving. So bebakhshid is to ask for forgiveness. To give, bebakhshid is to forgive. Yeah. But it's how you say, like, I'm sorry, but you say forgive me.
Exactly.
Me.
How beautiful.
And that word is so beautiful. I've never thought of forgiving.
Yeah, I love that connection. That's fantastic. Yeah. And for Ferdowsi, kind of that givingness begins with the source of existence, what we sometimes call the creator, whatever that force is. It's the first one to kind of practice and to bring in this idea of givingness, right? And it's a value that we could almost call like a divine value, right? This idea of just giving generously without any kind of expectation, right? And
so it's literally saying this door appeared, this door of forgiveness appeared. So even that is a visual element.
Yeah. In this case, I think it's more givingness than forgiveness, but certainly, yeah, it is a door, it is an opening, and in a way, it's kind of like you can imagine it almost like a gateway between kind of that unseen world of the creator and this world where we experience everything, right? There is this kind of opening And through that gateway, there is givingness. There is this process of some entity kind of bringing these things into existence for us on our behalf in a way, without expecting anything back. Right? It's like unconditionally giving, and I think that's a really incredible way to think about the origin of the universe and of everything as it continues to kind of appear in this world. That things appear and show up and are created without any expectation of anything, anyone kind of giving back. But of course, it's beautiful for us to acknowledge that and say, oh, there are so many blessings that we have, and how can we be grateful for that, even if we are not expected to, right? Because it's not something that is a burden. It's not our responsibility to be grateful, but it is actually a pleasure, right? It really is a beautiful feeling to acknowledge and be grateful for everything that we kind of receive in life,
Right. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is, these stories of creation always have the let there be light. And that comes up a lot in this selection that we've read right now, where
Nice.
there's like tire budosiyah. We have darkness, and tire being dark and black. And then at the end, we have this stars and brightness.
Yeah, exactly. How beautiful is that? So going from something that does not yet have that element of light on it and in it to something, a world that starts to kind of benefit from that light. And as you say, that seems to be a big part of all creation. And we can also look at that metaphorically, where something exists in a state of mystery, right? And then suddenly a light is shed upon it, and that mystery starts to kind of reveal itself. And that's another beautiful way to think about kind of existence, right? That it starts out as a mysterious thing, but then through some process, light starts to show up and awareness starts to show up, and the mysteries start to kind of unravel and reveal themselves. It's almost like a sense of discovery that we are gifted with as well. That's part of, I think, that original verse 11 that you were talking about, where this wise kind of source, right, is starting to grant everything, but in a way that is just, in a way that is proper. So where there is darkness, right, it also grants light, so that that darkness, that mystery can start to be discovered and revealed and unraveled. And so, bebachshid dana, again, bebachshid is also, forgive me, as you say, but it's also, it granted kind of generously and freely that which is wise, granted this, all of this, chonan chonsazi, in a way that was just, in a way that was proper, right? So that for Ferdowsi is really another very important part of thinking about the existence, the coming together of this universe, that things are, there is a proper place for everything. And the more that is allowed to be, the more there is justice in the world. So part of our job, maybe as humans, without getting too much into kind of social matters, but perhaps the implication is that part of our job is to make sure and to allow things to be in their proper place and not get so kind of involved in things from our egotistical sense and start to mess things up, right? There's a natural order to things that needs to be allowed to kind of unfold and take place. And part of our job is to allow, is to let that.
Wonderful. Okay, well, wonderful. I think we'll leave it at that for part 3 of this story of creation, and we'll be back with the next few lines in our next episode.
Great.
So, merci, Omid Jan. Is there anything else to think about before we dive into the next lesson?
I think part of what I would suggest to think about is just to see how the lessons so far start to tie together, and maybe kind of start to maybe just get a sense of where this might be going, right? And we'll see that, but just start to kind of get a feel for the general direction of the story.
Well, and it's amazing that this is going to lead into the story of Zal and Rustam and all these characters that we have come to love. Yes. So I have no idea how we get from here to there, but I'm excited to find out.
Sounds great.
All right, and until next time, Khedi Mamnoon, Khuda Hafiz from Layla.